Mikhail Leonidovich, glad to have you here. Good afternoon.
Hello?
I think we'll go in order, by topics, and as usual, let's start with international affairs. It's known that last Friday, the EU Council approved the 18th package of sanctions against Russia. It includes 14 individuals and 41 legal entities, among them 18 registered in various countries, including China. And accordingly, there was a response from the Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China. The inclusion of Chinese companies in the EU's anti-Russian sanctions package negatively affects trade relations between Beijing and Brussels. Mikhail Leonidovich, I've always wanted to ask you this question. Where does the European Union, as a structure, get so much self-confidence, especially economic self-confidence, considering, for example, their reluctance to purchase weapons from the United States? For major countries previously refused to participate in this arms program. On the other hand, there are these kinds of measures that, one way or another, negatively affect trade relations with China. But at the same time, there's militarization, stockpiling of arsenals, and all the corresponding rhetoric.
Well, that's absolutely obvious. There's really not even any question about it. The thing is, the people who have come to power in the European Union are, well, quite unprofessional and incompetent. Not just incompetent in terms of running a country, but even when it comes to wielding power. I mean, to put it bluntly, they're basically lackeys, riffraff and servants appointed to high positions. You know what I mean, right? What do you think will happen if you put some servant in the place of Khazin, who, let's say, has held that position for generations? It'll be a complete disaster. That's exactly what's happening here. And they also have this servant mentality. They don't think for themselves, and they definitely don't take responsibility. This is their most fundamental stance. We are not responsible for anything. And now they've settled into their cozy positions. And suddenly it became clear that the level of tension is rising. It doesn't matter why it's rising, objective circumstances, economic crisis, whatever. But they just don't want to admit it. And most importantly, they absolutely do not want to lose their positions, since they're incapable of doing anything. Moreover, they don't even understand what's going on. Basically, any action goes like this. First, you realize what's happening, then you develop some kind of action plan, and then you put that plan into practice. There are problems at every stage. If you're not competent, if you basically can't manage anything, then no matter how brilliant a plan you come up with, you won't be able to carry it out. If you don't have, systemic and strategic thinking with forecasting skills, you'll never come up with a proper, workable plan. And finally, the last thing. If you don't understand at all how the economy and everything else works, you simply can't understand what's going on at all. And so they are incompetent on all 3 points. But they really want to keep their places, and for this reason they make a completely remarkable story. They lied to their overlords who put them in place, that is, the leaders of the elite groups.
Yeah.
And secondly, they lied to the people, because otherwise they'll be thrown out. And even then, they have problems. In France, for example, Marine Le Pen with her National Front. Why are they trying to eliminate her in Germany? Alternative for Germany. And so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into the political squabbles in all these countries. I'm not much of a specialist in that. There are professionals in that field, but when it comes to economic issues, I'm a professional, and generally speaking, I understand something about public administration. And for that reason, I can say that, not understanding what's going on, they behave in a completely inadequate way. But of course, they can't be the ones at fault. So, someone has to be to blame. And someone has to be the source of money. So what do? They scare the world and the United States with the so-called Russian threat, and on top of that, they try to squeeze some money out of the US under this pretext.
There will be a lot more follow-up questions about this. Mikhail Leonidovich, I apologize for interrupting, but we already have a call coming into our studio. Hello, yes. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Good morning. My name is Kirill. I'm calling you from the city of Valdebaran. Mikhail Leonidovich, I'd like to ask you this. What if we, the world powers like China, Russia, and India, just simply ignore all these sanctions and restrictions from the Americans and do things the way that's convenient for us? Can we somehow exist without America? Sooner or later, they'll realize that they just can't sell their goods only within their own country. They'll want to sell them in Russia and China too. Trump will have to cancel those tariffs he's imposing.
Hello? So, this system, the Bretton Woods system, was created in 1944 and has been developing, for better or worse, for 80 years. And over these 80 years, it has, so to speak, become ingrained in everyone. In particular, China gets the overwhelming majority of its money from the United States of America. That doesn't mean it can't survive without the United States, but the transition from living with the US to living without the US is an extremely difficult crisis. It will still happen due to the collapse of the American system. But they're stalling because, well, they're also preparing for this crisis. That's exactly the whole problem. It's a pretty natural situation. When something has existed for a very long time, it's quite hard to give it up. That's it. And accordingly, you can't even imagine how deeply the dollar and the dollar system are embedded in what seem like entirely internal Russian institutions. And as soon as you clamp down on it with an iron fist, everything starts to fall apart. That doesn't mean it's impossible to create an alternative system. It's possible, but it's expensive, and it's a very slow, drawn-out process. That's why, for this reason, it's best not to do it all at once. I get that, of course. There are all sorts of nuances here. Yes, there are decisive people who say, "That's it, we're cutting ties with this." And there are people who say, "No, we need to act slowly and carefully." But I can say that, for example, when it comes to our financial authorities, who everyone criticizes for following the IMF, they're already groaning and turning to the political leadership, saying, "Guys, what are you doing? We've already been dragged through the mud, right? 95% of the population thinks we're bastards, scoundrels, and traitors." Well, that's not just a figure of speech, it's a statement of fact. But we're people, we have kids, grandkids, and so on, and so forth. Well, okay, fine. Many of us have children and grandchildren living abroad, right? Which, by the way, is also kind of strange how that happened, but still. And well, we ourselves, right, we can't show our faces in decent society, can we? There, people spit on our backs. But make a political decision that we will no longer be part of the Bretton Woods liberal model, that we'll leave on our own. But make the decision. You're just not making it. So how are you supposed to respond to that, right? And they're told, "No, guys, no. For so many years you enjoyed life, holding your positions and making trips to the West. Well, now it's your turn to suffer a bit." Basically, it's a delicate matter, and most importantly, it has nothing to do with the economy. Here you need to read Stairway to Heaven, the theory of power. And I can say that for these people, actually. Well, 15 years ago, you could envy them. They had everything and no responsibility at all. But now the picture looks completely different.
Mikhail Leonidovich, so how justified are Trump's concerns and his threats to impose tariffs against BRICS countries?
Listen, well,
He sees this as a threat. Well, statements like that don't just come out of nowhere. Or in Trump's case, maybe they do.
no, Trump. Look, there are two ways to hide a secret. The first way is to keep silent, like a communist under interrogation. Like, that's it. We don't know anything. We have no information, not even a hint. We don't understand a thing. The second way, talk so much and preferably contradict yourself that it's absolutely impossible to figure out, first, whether you actually said anything real, and second, whether it has any relevance to anything at all. That's Trump's method. You understand, he's dismantling the Bretton Woods system, of which the WTO is a part. Why is he dismantling it? Apparently, because he knows it's doomed anyway. Well, you know, we wrote about this book more than 20 years ago. Yeah, but well, it's doomed, yes. So, well, he's doing something over there.
Mikhail Leonidovich, continuing the topic about the European Union, sanctions, and all those stories. Obviously, we won't focus on the political factor right now, although you can't really avoid it in today's economic reality. But is it really possible that the people there, who are trying their hardest to hold on to their positions, to their seats, won't we see that effect of rats fleeing a sinking ship? Will it be such an instant effect, where the economy in a number of EU countries collapses, and along with it, the chairs that these modern EU officials are sitting on also fall? Or is there at least some kind of instinct for self-preservation left, when looking at the economic indicators?
Well, I can't really say anything about the officials. As for the economy, remember 2008, when all of this happened literally within an hour. The fall of 2008. The difference is, in 2007 the Americans managed to save the situation, but now that's impossible. You also have to add to this Trump's crypto laws, which undermine the Fed's monopoly, and so on and so forth. But overall, it's absolutely clear that all of this will, sort of, collapse over a certain period of time. For a while it seemed to me that Trump was trying to do this before the start of autumn. Before. But now, apparently, all this is being pushed back to the middle of autumn. But you have to understand, these things are all kind of probabilistic. Something could happen tomorrow. Maybe everything will happen tomorrow. Well, like Israel could launch a nuclear strike on Tehran. I'm just giving an example. That's the kind of thing, like the ultimate force majeure, right? Exactly. By the way, I don't actually think Israel will launch a nuclear strike on Tehran, but it's still unclear how all of this will end. But the fact that they're really ramping up the conflict in the Middle East is absolutely obvious. Here's the picture, yeah? So that's how I would look at the whole situation. Well, look, right? Have you ever seen something fall apart? I used to do this as a kid. You build some kind of castle out of sugar cubes, and then you pour hot tea over it. At first, just a little, and it starts to settle from the bottom, then it crumbles, and so on. That's exactly what's happening today. There are structures that are very resilient, and most likely they'll survive even after the crisis, and there are some that will collapse. Basically, in short, this is something that needs to be studied specifically. I give lectures on this topic. I have this series called Economics in Russian, where I sort of describe the whole economic situation. Now, apparently, in a week I will do a webinar that will be dedicated to practical actions in response to Trump's laws. Not theoretically.
Yes.
What do they mean? There's something else there. What should people do? Well, they are buying our oil. Everyone else is buying at normal prices, but these guys say, we'll only buy if it's cheap. In theory, they're supposed to impose secondary sanctions on those who do buy. Well, can you imagine the European Union imposing secondary sanctions against India or China? China has already said shush, and that's that. What's there to discuss? There's nothing to talk about here.
Well, they already tried to take a swing at some papelas, but it didn't work out.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. You have to understand, how should I put it? Any action of this kind always comes at a cost. That is, In order to force someone to do something, you yourself have to pay something. And sometimes you have to pay even more than what they lose. Well, roughly speaking, if your GDP is 100 and his is 10, and you impose sanctions worth 5, but you have to pay 10 for that, then you lose 10%. Yes, for a while, instead of a GDP of 100, you end up with a GDP of 90. That's a heavy blow, but it's bearable. And for him, instead of 10, it becomes 5. His drops by half. That's a total catastrophe. And then there are two options. Either he digs in, like North Korea, and at some point you realize you've run out of leverage, right? And he starts acting out. And any move you make to lift the sanctions is obviously a win for him. But he can just say, no, 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 now we're going to do things on our own. And now we have North Korea, a country that has missiles, nuclear weapons, and, generally speaking, a population that isn't starving and is also mobilized. And we have South Korea, which already had economic difficulties, and then someone else, namely Trump, imposed tariffs. So what is South Korea going to do?
It's really telling how the status of the head of state grows in such situations. Remember how proud Trump was that he personally met with Kim Jong-un.
And I can tell you why. Because Kim Jong-un didn't give in. And Trump, in reality, despises weaklings. Who didn't give in to him? Putin didn't give in, and Kim Jong-un didn't either. That's it. Everyone else gave in. Well, you know, they are different. Everyone's playing some kind of game, right? Even Xi really is in a tough spot. That's all there is to it.
But anyway, one way or another, we keep coming back to Trump. But now my colleagues are telling me that we have a call coming into the Sputnik radio studio. Hello, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Alexander Yuryevich Sazonov. Could you please tell me what happened to our National Wealth Fund? Thank you.
That's not a question for me. I don't deal with budgetary matters of any kind. No, it still exists, but I don't know its current size or how it's being managed. But that's a rather specific thing, budget policy. Someone like Mikhail Genevievich Delyagin, for example, really knows that area well. I don't even get into that topic for a simple reason. I just don't have the time. There's simply no time for it. That's it. So, what else? You know, when you have someone who really knows their stuff, back when I was at the Economic Directorate of the President of the Russian Federation, there was Oleg Grigoriev, who was the head of the budget department. And I never even thought about that topic. I'd just call Oleg Grigoriev and say, Oleg, explain this to me. Oleg would explain it. That's all. Same thing here. Yeah, why should I waste my time? I've got enough of my own worries.
And plenty of topics to deal with. All right, let's move on then, Mikhail Leonidovich. Getting back to all sorts of contradictory statements, take the same American Senator Lindsey Graham, who regularly stands out with his, let's be honest, anti-Russian rhetoric. By the way, he's been added to Russia's list of terrorists and extremists. And on Fox News, he announced that US President Trump plans to impose a 100% tariff on countries buying Russian oil. As for the European Union, since we've already mentioned them, they can lower the oil price cap as much as they want, but they don't actually buy it, so it doesn't matter. Here, the United States acts as a kind of regulator. How effective do you think these measures could be as a tool of pressure?
Let's first wait until they actually make some decisions on this, and then we'll see. Why should we waste time speculating, right? As experience has shown, not all these speculations come true. The experience of the past 3+ years has shown, not all these speculations come true. Period.
The tactics and overall approach to these kinds of things, even manipulations, are interesting, I would say, because Russia, even when the 18th package of sanctions was adopted, responded from our side in a very delicate way. First, we need to study the content, and then, possibly, countermeasures will be taken. What kind of countermeasures? What exactly they are remains a mystery. But that's probably a good thing, Mikhail Leonidovich, when, they're not shouting from every platform about how we're going to impose sanctions, 100% tariffs, and all that.
Well, you have to understand, they're all playing the same game. It's about who puts on the best show. Do you really think Graham is just an individual? He's more like a representative of certain groups. Groups that are trying to put pressure on Russia. They're trying to intimidate. How exactly? Well, look, right? Let's say you're walking down the street at night and three tough-looking guys come up to you and say, well, if they're teenagers, they say, give me 20 kopecks. And if they're adults, they say, could you please lend us 100 rubles? I'm just recalling a story. There were people in our country who acted like that, and they were convicted. And the thing is, those bastards, the way they defended themselves, they'd say, what's the problem? If someone says no, we just apologize and leave. But the scene itself, just by itself, is so frightening.
That's a very telling example from parents, Kali. Well, let's continue our discussion. In the first half of the program, we talked a lot about oil, and there are some interesting related news. Hungary, Serbia, and Russia have discussed building an oil pipeline between Hungarian and Serbian territories to supply Russian oil. This was reported by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary. It's known that Hungary is actively discussing this issue with Serbia, the construction of this new oil pipeline. But what's new is that Russia is actively participating in this discussion. This is being reported for the first time. So, Mikhail Leonidovich, would you say this is a kind of adaptation to the challenges that have directly arisen as a result of both the sanctions policy and the ideological stance of Western countries?
Well, the thing is, everyone understands that everything is going to fall apart, right? There are leaders of countries who are responsible for their nations, and there are those who aren't. Or more precisely, they are responsible to those who appointed them. For example, Orban and Fico are responsible to their own countries, and they're building some kind of complex, cunning policy there. And, accordingly, and, of course, they have to maneuver. Why don't they leave the European Union? By the way, Orban answered this question not so long ago. Well, because for now, it's beneficial for us as a country. As soon as it stops being beneficial, we'll leave. That's it. Now, why they're in NATO, that's a complicated question. I don't know why. Maybe it's because they understand that otherwise there's a risk, for example, of an attack from Ukraine. Because Ukraine is insanely afraid that Hungary might demand, for example, that ethnic Hungarians not be drafted into the war. And so on and so forth. Basically, that's the problem for any small country. They always have to maneuver. There's this wonderful play by Scribe called A Glass of Water. And we had a great film adaptation with Kirill Lavrov and Balog Vostokova in the lead roles. And there's a scene where Kirill Lavrov playing Viscount Bolingbroke. By the way, this play has absolutely nothing to do with real history, none at all.
Right.
And so, he explains to a young lady that woe betide a small state if a large neighboring one decides to conquer it. It's impossible to defend yourself. There's only one single chance, if two big states both want to seize it at the same time, because then they'll do everything they can to keep the other from succeeding. You see? That's why they have to keep maneuvering and scheming. What else can they do? Nowhere to go. No way out.
But in that case, what's worrying is the growing pressure on countries that show prudence and responsibility. At the very least, I don't know, towards their own people, towards their own country's economy, and so on. But for them, right?
You see, in Brussels and Berlin, they couldn't care less about Orban's responsibility to his own people or about the Hungarian people at all. The only thing they care about is that they, first and foremost, do as they're told. That's it. That's why they're trying to force them into this, well, sort of fake pyramid of fear so that they can't back out anymore. But some have already been forced in. Look at Azerbaijan, for example, they're being pushed in. Even though Azerbaijan isn't a member of NATO or, accordingly, the European Union. And so on and so forth. The only one who managed to break free is Georgia. That's why it's having problems now. No doubt, it will solve these problems. That's it. Here's what I can say. What's happening now is the result of a constantly worsening economic crisis. At the same time, we have problems with this too, but they're of a different nature. The thing is, precisely because we haven't made a political decision to finally break away from the liberal model, the liberal privatization elites of the 90s are still very influential here. And the real problem isn't even about specific individuals. The real problem is that they've created an environment in which they've raised, well, government officials. And these officials, they've absorbed the same spirit as the European Union, that is, a total lack of accountability. Well, for example, I'll just give an example because someone wrote to me about this today. A new GOST standard has been adopted for, school backpacks.
Yeah.
There are, like, restrictions on materials, restrictions on weight, and some other things. I can assure you, this will lead to higher prices for these school backpacks. And most people here, generally speaking, aren't wealthy. They can't afford it. They want to go to school with their old backpacks, but they'll be told, no, you can't use those. Kids will be told this at school. You see, in the past, parents could keep track of what was happening at school. Today, that's impossible. And kids are really bullied there. And, well, I just know this because people tell me about it. There are, of course, some good schools, but they're extremely rare. And teachers can't handle everything. They have to fill out all sorts of pointless paperwork, and they don't have time for anything else. So, why is it that officials, when approving standards for materials and, things like school uniforms, backpacks, and so on, don't make a different decision? First of all, school uniforms and backpacks should be sold in special departments. And in these departments, there must be, without fail, backpacks and school uniforms that meet the standards, sold at a price lower than this. In other words, if you can't find a manufacturer who can make these backpacks cheaply, you have no right to sell the expensive ones. Period. Because poor people come in, and there's nothing for them, everything is for millionaires. So what are they supposed to do? You see what I mean? This is exactly what needs to be done. This is what we need to be thinking about. Like in the USSR, at the collective farm markets, there was always a state-run store. They sold bad tomatoes, bad cucumbers, and bad potatoes there, but they were very cheap, and just by existing, they pushed prices down. It's the same thing here. If you start selling a school backpack for 100,000 rubles, then you'd better make sure there's a school backpack next to it for 3,000, or better yet, for 1,500. And if there isn't one, the inspector comes and says, "Oh, there's no backpack." That's it. We're shutting you down. Now, so that, here, I'm putting a seal on your door. If you want, that's great. You invite the commission, show them the cheap backpack, and we'll reopen you. But keep in mind, the commission has a lot on their plate, so they might not come right after your call, but in 2 or 3 days. Or, you know how it is. Just wait, they'll come within a week.
And it's actually very telling. Every year the media writes about how much it costs to get a child ready for school. Right. And naturally, people judge, of course, because
That's exactly what I'm saying. Guys, if you want, let's say you're the governor and you've got these wealthy merchants with big stores. You tell them, look, we've decided that a full set of school supplies should cost this much. For the poor, if a parent can't come in and buy a full set at that price, we'll shut you down. Then the people don't need you. In fact, you're not needed at all. You're great for the rich folks. Well, fine. Go cater to the rich. Drive out to all those fancy Rubliovka neighborhoods. You know, go door to door like salesmen and say, we've brought you something. Look, a school backpack for 100,000 rubles. And here's one for 200,000 from Gucci. Or something like that.
honestly, I'd be interested to hear what the listeners think about this. Especially those who are getting their kids ready for school right now. It's peak season, right? What do you think about this initiative, huh? So, the introduction of the GOST, the already adopted GOST, regarding school backpacks. And actually, we already have a call, by the way. I didn't even have time to finish my thought. Hello, please introduce yourself.
Hello, Oleg Rostov-on-Don. I have a question for you, Mikhail Leonidovich. To generally increase monetization, they use faster turnover of funds. Right. And the digital ruble, will it be more liquid, for example, than today's PayPay cards for all those phone payment methods? Or is it being done for some other purpose, like tracking people's money? Because right now, the ruble on cards is also electronic. It's not cash either. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll let you in on a big secret. I already talked to Oleg live on air today. The broadcast. So, let me answer. First of all, nobody really knows how to measure the velocity of money. There are some relative methods. Like, for example, if you have Gessel-style depreciating money or high inflation, everyone tries to get rid of their money faster because the longer you hold onto it, the less it's worth. That's how it is. But overall, it's not really clear how to do this. And most importantly, since it's unclear how much the velocity actually increases, well, some measures are taken, and it speeds up. But like any measures, they come at a cost. So the question is about the balance between the benefits of speeding up money circulation and, well, the losses from implementing these measures. For this reason, tools to accelerate money circulation are usually not used in the economy, or at least not considered. That's how it is. That's how it is.
Mikhail Leonidovich, if I may, I have a question. Lately, we've been talking so much about GOST standards, and people are suggesting implementing this GOST system for just about everything. First of all, why did people start talking about it again? Secondly, we just discussed backpacks. On the other hand, just the other day, there was a proposal to introduce a GOST standard for beer, for example. There are Russian wines, and now there's a proposal to create Russian beer as well. After talking to experts, we found out that 95% of the consumer market is already Russian beer. But this GOST standard also requires domestic ingredients, hops, malt, which, at least for now, we simply can't produce in such quantities in our country. What's the point of this, if from the very start, even at the idea stage, it's already unprofitable and will end up affecting the final price for the consumer, even if it's just by a few cents?
When I was a school kid, I used to live at my grandmother's dacha, and not far from our place there was a spot called the settlement of Rosmol. That's the Kalistovo station on the Yaroslavl Railway. And there, as you'd expect, those slanted poles were standing, and, well, hops were growing. It's a vine, after all. You know, in the early 90s, everything was destroyed. And now we practically don't have our own hops. Very little, really. Why? Well, how come? Well, it's obvious why. The liberals came. What was it Gaidar used to say? Why make our own airplanes when we can just buy them in America? There you go. And for that reason, it's a complicated issue. Secondly, you know, right here nearby, you're going to laugh, right? Near the place where I am now, there's a brewery in a house not far from here. There was a time when this brewery made good beer, but now it makes bad beer, and we don't drink it anymore. We drink other beer. I won't say which one, but everyone in Crimea knows which one I mean.
So what's the pattern here? Why did ours get worse?
It's named after a place near the city of Belogorsk. So, here's the thing. You can create a GOST standard, sure. But how are you going to make people actually follow that GOST? Let me give you another example. I stopped buying bread in stores in Moscow, well, in bakeries, because it's just impossible to eat. By the second day, it crumbles into little lumps and gets moldy. But here, I bought myself some bread, and it was even pre-sliced, which means, in theory, it should go stale even faster. It's been sitting there for a week already, and it's hardly gone stale, hasn't gotten moldy, and its taste hasn't changed. I can tell you why that is. It's made from flour. But in Moscow, more than half of what's in that bread is all sorts of anticoagulants and other various chemical additives, and they're imported, too. And this is the real, so how do you explain that? Where is that coming from? Where are all those so-called defenders of purity?
Yeah, where's the public oversight? Where are the proper authorities? We have a call coming into our studio.
Back in the USSR, officials are 3 times as many as in the Soviet era.
That's true. Let's continue on this topic. We have a call coming into our studio. Mikhail Leonidovich, hello. Please introduce yourself.
Hello. I'm from the Moscow region. I'm a pensioner. And I have this question for you, Mikhail Leonidovich. Your shows are very interesting, but it turns out that I am visually impaired. Could you please tell me, besides the 2 radio stations, Говорит Moskva and Sputnik, do you have any other talking radio or a talking website? Because I can't read.
I have a Telegram channel. It's called Khazin, and all my shows are posted there in audio format. The only thing is, there's a private Telegram channel with a paid entry. It's cheap, but still paid. There, the audio versions appear right away. On the public channel, they show up with a bit of a delay. But if you can watch, you can turn on the video, then by all means, you can watch the video and just listen to the audio. Especially since, usually, apart from my mug, there's nothing else in the video. So,
All right, let's move on then. Honestly, the topic about GOST standards and all these stories with regulatory agencies, the number of officials, which you've already mentioned, is really up for debate. And at the same time, when you read news like, for example, Nikolenko speaking about implementing artificial intelligence in the Russian economy, saying that we need to move from talk to more active implementation to action. In short, most of the questions that come up are about the basics. Isn't it a bit too soon to just, boom, push all this forward with artificial intelligence? Mikhail Leonidovich, how do you see this whole situation?
oh, for heaven's sake, it's just a tool. In reality, there is no such thing as artificial intelligence. You see, everyone gets confused by the word intelligence. It's simply a system for processing large databases, that's all. You see, theoretically, All of this could have been done in software even 25 years ago, but there just weren't fast enough computers back then to handle it properly. But otherwise, everything.
So it's like speeding up, I don't know, and simplifying document flow and keeping the books properly, right, if you look at it purely as a business support tool.
Exactly. Look, there used to be this profession called a typist lady. But now that profession doesn't exist anymore. Now you can just dictate, and the text appears right away on the computer. And you can print it out 100 times if you want. A typist used to make 3 copies. So, you see how much everything has changed, right? Life has become different.
But will it become simpler and, well, I don't know, more accessible for the average person? Mikhail Leonidovich?
It's a technical thing. Well, okay. Before, if you were coming from the village, you'd take a car to the city, but now you can drive a car, and a car is much faster. And then airplanes appeared, but now, you see, planes don't fly to Crimea. That's a shame. Yes, it creates certain problems. If planes were flying, I'd be living here. Say, in Moscow, you get on a plane in the morning, fly in, do what you need to do, and either in the evening or the next morning you fly back. What is there to do in Moscow? That's it. There's nothing to do there.
Here, I guess it's a question of setting priorities, Mikhail Leonidovich. We keep talking endlessly about the key interest rate, for example. And yes, they raised the utilities tariffs. That's what people are really concerned about right now, at least at the moment.
Why did they even raise the utilities rates? You see what I mean? I'm deeply convinced that these very people, the ones raised in the 90s, are deliberately causing trouble. That's it. Well, at least when you look at it, it's the whole package, right? They say inflation is low, just 12%. But have you looked at the cost of getting a kid ready for school these days? Has that gone up by 12%? Yeah. Are you sure about that?
The eternal questions arise. What should we do? And how should we do it?
Well, I try to answer as best I can within my abilities. Just go to Khazin's Telegram channel. There are some paid options there, but they're not too expensive for most people. That's how it is. What else can you do? Really, what else is there?
But Russians' bank deposits are growing. Mikhail Leonidovich, as we wrap up.
The money is growing, that's true. Yeah, but it'll run out soon.
On that note, which I guess is a bit dramatic, we'll wrap up our broadcast for today. Thank you very much, Mikhail Leonidovich. Economist Mikhail Khazin.